There is a mine in the Ural region of Russia that no longer appears on any government map. It was operational until 1973. Then one night, a drilling crew working the deepest shaft, a borehole that had taken 11 years to reach, broke through a section of wall that should not have been hollow. The foreman's report, filed the following morning, described the cavity beyond as a room, not a natural cavern, a room, with walls that showed no tool marks but reflected light like polished stone. The crew was pulled out. The shaft was sealed. 3 of the 7 men never filed another work report after that date, not because they died, but because there is simply no further record that they existed. That report has circulated in certain research communities for decades. Mainstream historians call it a fabrication. Anomalous architecture researchers call it one of the most consistent data points in a body of evidence that keeps growing no matter how many times it is buried. And what that body of evidence points toward is a civilization so vast, so technically sophisticated, and so deliberately erased from the historical record that most people cannot process it when they first encounter it. Not because it sounds impossible, but because it sounds too possible. This is the story of what miners find when they go deep enough, what construction crews uncover when they dig foundations in cities that were supposedly wilderness 200 years ago. What the shafts and the sub-basements and the sealed lower levels of buildings across 4 continents have in common, and why, in every case, the official explanation arrives quickly, holds poorly, and is never revisited. If you have never heard of Tartaria, stay with this. If you have, stay anyway. Because what comes next goes further than the maps and the architecture. This channel exists because these questions deserve more than a forum post. Subscribe now and hit the bell, because the next video continues directly from where this one ends. The name Tartaria does not appear in most modern history textbooks. That absence is, in itself, the first data point worth examining. For centuries, Tartaria appeared on European maps as a massive territorial designation covering much of Central Asia, Siberia, parts of Eastern Europe, and sections of what is now northern China. It was not a vague label. Cartographers from the 1500s through the early 1800s marked it consistently with internal subdivisions: independent Tartary, Chinese Tartary, Muscovite Tartary, suggesting not a catch-all geographic term but a recognized geopolitical reality. The 1771 Encyclopaedia Britannica devoted a substantial entry to it, describing its people, its cities, its governance structure. Then, over the course of the 19th century, Tartaria disappeared. Not through conquest documented in any war history, not through a treaty. It was simply no longer labelled. The maps changed. The encyclopedias were revised. And the civilization that had been acknowledged for 300 years of European cartography was reclassified as a medieval misconception. Researchers who study this transition point out something that does not fit the misconception theory. Misconceptions do not generate consistent architectural residue. Misconceptions do not leave behind thousands of identical buildings on 6 continents, all sharing the same proportional systems, the same decorative grammar, the same impossible construction tolerances for their supposed era, and the same tendency to have sealed lower floors that predate the structures built above them. Walk through the old quarter of any major city in Europe, in the Americas, in Russia, in India. Look at the buildings that are described as 18th or early 19th century construction. Look at the ceilings. Look at the windows placed at heights that suggest the ground floor you are standing on is not the original ground floor. Look at the basement levels when they are accessible at all, and notice how they do not look like basements. They look like the first floors of something that was buried. This is what researchers call the mud flood hypothesis, and it is one of the most controversial and most visually compelling arguments in the Tartaria discussion. The claim is straightforward. At some point in the relatively recent past, a catastrophic event, likely within the last 3 to 4 centuries, deposited massive quantities of sediment across enormous areas of the populated world. Cities were not destroyed, they were buried, And the civilization that came after, whether through ignorance or deliberate erasure, built on top of what remained, sealed the lower levels, and wrote a new history that began above the sediment line. The photographic evidence circulated by researchers is difficult to dismiss on purely visual grounds. 19th century photographs of cities across the American Midwest, taken within decades of those cities' supposed founding dates, show buildings with ground floor windows that are already half submerged, not damaged, not incomplete. Submerged, as if the earth around them simply rose. The buildings themselves show no signs of being newly built. They show signs of being old buildings in a landscape that changed around them. In St. Petersburg, in Chicago, in Melbourne, in dozens of cities, you find the same pattern. A first floor level that does not make sense as a first floor. Doors that open onto walls of earth, windows positioned for a street level that is several feet below the current grade. Architects and city historians explain these features as stylistic choices, or as adaptations to local drainage requirements, or as simply how buildings were constructed at the time. What they cannot explain is why the same anomaly appears across cities with no contact with each other, built by different cultures in different climates at different supposed periods of construction. Now, return to the mines. The relationship between the Tartaria hypothesis and what gets found underground is not incidental. If a civilization existed that was both more extensive and more technically advanced than the history we have been given, then it left infrastructure. Not just buildings, infrastructure in the way that serious civilizations build infrastructure, roads, water systems, energy distribution networks, and the deep excavations that any large-scale mining or construction operation requires. What miners have reported across Siberia, across the Appalachian Range in the United States, across sections of the Urals and the Altai, and in excavations beneath several major European cities, is not random cave systems. It is engineered space, tunnels with consistent diameter, chambers with flat floors and right-angle walls, passages lined with materials that do not match anything in the geological record of the surrounding stone. And in some cases, blocked passages, sealed not by collapse but by deliberate placement of material from the other side. The mine referenced at the beginning of this video is one of several. A researcher working under the name Anatoly Fomenko, not the mathematician, a different individual, spent 6 years collecting first-hand accounts from former Soviet mining operations in the Ural and Siberian regions. His compiled records, circulated in Russian-language alternative history communities since the late 1990s, describe 17 separate incidents between 1930 and 1985 in which mining operations encountered pre-existing subsurface structures. In 12 of those 17 cases, the structures were sealed and the find was classified. In 3 cases, the workers were relocated without explanation. In 2 cases, the records of the operations simply end. The Soviet context is important here, and not for the reason most Western audiences assume. The assumption is that Soviet secrecy explains everything, that the USSR classified anomalous finds as a matter of routine political paranoia. That explanation holds for some things. It does not hold for this, because the pattern of sealing and suppression did not begin with the Soviet state. It predates it. Accounts from Tsarist-era mining operations in the same regions described the same behavior. Foremen instructed to stop drilling in certain directions. Shafts rerouted without documentation. Workers transferred. The bureaucratic response to whatever is down there did not originate with 20th century ideology. It originated with something found and something decided long before. What researchers find most significant about the consistent suppression pattern is what it implies about institutional continuity. Governments change, political systems collapse and are replaced, but the decision to seal what gets found underground has remained consistent across Tsarist Russia, the Soviet Union, and the contemporary Russian Federation, across colonial administrations and the independent nations that replaced them, across different centuries and different continents. The only explanation for that level of consistency is not bureaucratic habit. It is a shared understanding of what is down there and a shared decision about what to do with that knowledge. Consider the specific nature of what gets sealed. It is never the empty space itself that triggers the response. Empty caverns, natural or otherwise, get documented and sometimes opened to researchers. What triggers the sealing response is evidence of construction. The moment a shaft breaks into something deliberately made, it gets closed. That specificity matters. It means the decision makers understand the distinction between a geological anomaly and an architectural one, and that they have a protocol for the latter that exists separately from any protocol for the former. Protocols that are maintained across centuries and regime changes do not exist without a very serious reason. There is also the question of what the rooms contain. In the accounts where the drilling crew had enough time to look, a 1947 account from an American coal operation in southern West Virginia, collected by a regional folklorist and published in a small circulation journal in 1961, describes a chamber containing objects with surfaces and edges that no one in the crew could identify as any manufactured material they recognized. The folklorist treated it as local legend. The journal no longer exists in any archive that researchers have been able to locate. The name of the mine was never recorded. These details are consistent with how this information tends to move, partially obliquely, through publications that do not survive. The Tartaria hypothesis does not require you to believe in hidden elites or coordinated global conspiracy in the conventional sense. It requires something simpler and, in some ways, more unsettling. That a civilization capable of building on a global scale was erased from the record so thoroughly that the physical evidence of its existence is now scattered across the sub-basements and sealed mine shafts of every continent on Earth, and that the institutions that keep encountering that evidence have, generation after generation, made the same choice about what to do with it. Here is what makes the mine accounts different from the above-ground architectural evidence. The buildings can be explained away one by one with sufficient effort, stylistic choices, drainage adaptations, misidentified construction dates. Each explanation is thin, and the cumulative weight of thousands of thin explanations eventually collapses under its own improbability. But the mine accounts cannot be explained away with aesthetics or regional building tradition. A room at the bottom of a drill shaft with polished walls and no tool marks is not a stylistic choice. It is either there or it is not. And the consistent institutional response to it, the sealing, the silence, the disappeared records, is either a pattern or it is not. It is a pattern. The miner who broke through that wall in the Ural shaft in 1973 filed a report. The report described what he saw. Then the shaft was sealed, the report was classified, and the man filed nothing further. He was not, in all likelihood, the first person to find that room. He was almost certainly not the last. There are researchers, working outside institutions, working without funding, working in languages that most Western audiences do not read, who have spent decades mapping what gets found and sealed. Their work does not appear in academic journals. It appears in the places that information goes, when the channels that should carry it are closed. This channel is committed to covering that work, not because every claim in it is verified, but because the pattern of suppression is itself the most verified thing about this subject, and patterns of suppression deserve more scrutiny than they receive. What is most important to understand before the next video is this. The question is not whether something was built beneath the world we inherited. The question is what it means that we inherited a world with the bottom floors sealed off. What does it mean to live above something that someone decided you should not see? What does it mean that the decision has held this long, this consistently across this many changes, in who claims to be in charge? Those are not rhetorical questions. They are the questions this channel is going to spend as long as it takes to work through properly. Subscribe now if you have not already. Share this video with one person who asks the right questions, and come back for the next one, because the deeper this goes, the more the shape of what is down there starts to come clear. The history you were given has a flaw. What this channel does, what this series commits to doing video by video, is find the stairs.